Psalm 91 is the second psalm of Book 4. Following on the heels of Psalm 90, which is about the frailty of man and how at our best we might live 70, 80 years, Psalm 91 is a very powerful expression of God's protection over the believer in some very universal and categorical ways. The occasion for the psalm might have been a prayer before battle. Because the promises in this psalm are so grand and so expansive, it could be that this psalm was the kind of prayer that someone might pray before they were headed into battle, where you needed an extra measure of confidence and trust that God was going to keep you safe. Otherwise, you couldn't face the conflict that was ahead of you. It is classified as a psalm of trust, then, for that reason. It begins with this dramatic statement, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge, my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." So it begins with this categorical statement of God's protection as a refuge and a fortress. Now, what are the threats that the psalmist and we might face? Well, first, they are, verse 3, the snare of the fowler. So this is a bird hunter that would set a snare. Deadly pestilence, that is disease or plague. How about verse 5? The terror of the night. So just particularly if you are on a battlefield, very difficult to sleep at night. You never know if you're going to be attacked. And so there is that terror of night. There is the, I don't want it to get dark. I don't want to go to sleep because I am fearful of what's in the dark. Or in contrast to that, the arrow that flies by the day, that which I can see, the enemy that's in front of me that is shooting at me. Or, in contrast, verse 6, the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. Disease and plague were a very real thing in the ancient world. This is a pre-modern world where thoughts of hygiene and medical care were so different than what they are now. And yet even today, in the day of coronavirus, we understand that we are not immune from these things as well. So these are the threats that the psalmist is thinking of when he reflects on the sheltering nature of the Most High God. The dominant image here of God is that he is portrayed as a bird protecting its young. This is an example of zoomorphism, where God is portrayed in the form of an animal, or humans in the form of animals. That's zoomorphism. So here, God is portrayed as a very protective, mothering bird. Verse 4 says he will cover you with his pinions, with his feathers, and under his wings you'll find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and a buckler. A buckler is a small shield on the hand. So his faithfulness is a shield. You'll not fear the terror of night, the arrow by day, the pestilence at dark or noonday. So we have several different statements of time, night and day. But you'll be protected, you'll not be afraid. In verse 7, this is where we think that this psalm might have been used as a predecessor to battle, is 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. So as you are running into battle, even though every single person to your left and right is struck down, you will be invincible. Verse 8, you will only look with your eyes and see the recompense. So you will not be injured. That's a very categorical, absolute type of statement, isn't it? Verse 9, because you've made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge, and we might think of Psalm 90 here, which says that the Lord is our dwelling place from everlasting to everlasting. And there is this promise in verse 10 that no evil shall befall you, no plague come near your tent. And I have to say, this promise sometimes bothers me because it is so absolute, because all of us know people, in fact, who have died of disease, of illness, and in fact, every one of us will die. And so this psalm cannot be promising that you'll never get sick and that you will never die. That cannot be what it's saying. It must be saying this in poetic terms, that in general terms, God will protect you. God will be your refuge. And even when you are sick, even when plague does come near your tent, you can still find rest and strength in the presence of God. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. So God has angels that are ministering spirits that are sent to serve us. Hebrews 1:14 tells us. And the Old Testament then, in one of few references to angels here, describes them as guardian angels. And so that's where we get that idea of angels watching out and protecting us. Now, this verse is significant because it is the only verse from the Psalms that is quoted by Satan. You might recall this is the temptation of Christ in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, where Satan tells Jesus, hey, throw yourself down from this high place, and the Scriptures say that the angels will bear you up so you won't strike your foot against a stone. And how does Jesus respond to that? He says, don't test me. Don't put the Lord your God to the test. In other words, yeah, I could throw myself down here and God could and would rescue me, but that would be putting him to the test. That'd be doing something stupid. So don't put God to the test. Don't do something stupid on the promise that he won't let anything bad happen to you. And I find it also fascinating that the very next verse is also alluded to by Jesus in a different context. You'll tread on the lion and the adder, the snake, the young lion and the serpent you'll trample underfoot. Now, Jesus in Luke 10 sends out the 70 in pairs. They go out and they preach and they heal and they witness the mighty power of God unleashed as they cast out demons. And they come back and Jesus worships. He turns his eyes to heaven. He rejoices and he states in that context that I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And I've given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. That's Luke 10:18 and 19. And so Jesus takes this very next verse, following the verses that Satan had quoted, to refer to the fact that Satan himself, the tempter, would be stomped upon, trampled, treaded upon, not only by Jesus, but by his disciples. I think that's pretty cool, that the very verses that Satan quotes, the very next verse following those verses, describes his ultimate defeat. And then God speaks in the final verses and says, because he holds fast to me in love, I will deliver him. I will protect him because he knows my name. When he calls on me, I'll answer. I'll be with him. I'll rescue him. I'll honor him. I'll satisfy him with long life and show him his salvation. Now, again, this can't mean that you will never die. It says with long life, I'll satisfy him. It can't mean that you'll never get sick, but it does mean that God is with us in those moments. I'll be with him in trouble. I'll rescue him. And how does God rescue us? He rescues us from death ultimately, because through Jesus he has conquered death. He has destroyed him who holds the power of death, Hebrews 2:14, and set us free from our fear of death. I find it significant that this psalm becomes part of the title of the story of Jim Elliot, a book by Elizabeth Elliot, The Shadow of the Almighty, the Life and Testament of Jim Elliot. Now, you ought to read the story of Jim and Elizabeth Elliot. In the 50s, Jim Elliot and 4 other men were slain by the Auca Indians in South America. They had gone there to take the gospel, and they felt pretty good that they'd made some connections with this tribe, but they're greeted instead with a hail of spears and arrows. And Elizabeth Elliot writes the story of her husband, Jim Elliot, and she uses a phrase from this psalm, the shadow of the Almighty, in that book. How can it be that a man who was literally killed by spears and arrows, how could it be that his wife would say that he lived and died under the protection of the Almighty? Well, it's because Jim Elliot understood the truth of this psalm, is that the victory ultimately does belong to the believer, that death has no ultimate power over us. Jim Elliot famously said, he is no fool who gives up that which he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. That which we cannot keep, of course, is our life. We cannot keep our life. And so it's not foolish to give up that life in exchange for that which we cannot lose. that is eternal life. So this psalm, in a very ironic way, in its vast, expansive promises that you'll never get sick, you'll never be wounded in battle, that thousands will fall all around you, but you won't be touched. These grand promises of safety and protection find their ultimate fulfillment in the fact that Jesus has crushed the head of the serpent. He has closed the mouth of the lion, the roaring lion that seeks to devour us, by conquering death, and we experience victory over death itself through Jesus.